Picture this. It's the dead of winter in Pyongyang.
Oh, right. Up in the northern border.
Exactly. Deeply isolated northern border province of North Korea. And there's this mother sitting in her unheated home, like the cold is just completely seeping through the walls.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brutal environment just on its own.
It is. But she isn't thinking about, grand geopolitical strategy or the balance of power in the Middle East. Her entire universe right now is focused on just one thing.
Her kid.
Her teenage son. He's rapidly approaching the age of mandatory military conscription. And the reason she's terrified isn't just the standard brutal reality of the Korean People's Army.
Right, it's the rumors.
It's the whispers she's hearing down at the Jangbadang, the local black markets. Like, rumors are spreading from stall to stall, asking one terrifying question. Are they going to send our boys to die fighting a war in Iran?
That is just a really visceral, deeply human moment of panic. I mean, it's a raw look at what happens in an information vacuum. It's completely hidden from those polished, triumphant broadcasts you see on state television.
Right, exactly. So hold that image, because we are going to jump thousands of miles away. You are the captain of a massive, multi-ton commercial container ship.
Like, totally different world.
Completely.
Yeah.
You're standing on the bridge, staring dead ahead at the radar screens. You're navigating the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is, what, a 21-mile pinch point?
Yeah, a super narrow transit corridor. And suddenly the VHF radio crackles. You aren't being boarded, but you are being halted.
By a fast attack craft.
A heavily armed fast attack craft broadcasts an unexpected non-negotiable demand, a $2 million toll.
Wow.
Just to sail your ship from point A to point B.
I mean, that functions as a literal ransom on global trade.
Yeah.
It's executed in real time on the open ocean.
Yeah.
Literally turning a geographic bottleneck into a geopolitical weapon.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And now, for our third and final scene, let's move to a brightly lit, mahogany-paneled office in Tehran. A veteran Iranian politician, a man who has built his entire, formidable career on a reputation of iron-fisted resilience and anti-Western rhetoric.
Right, a real hardliner.
Exactly. But he is suddenly caught in the middle of a massive media firestorm. Because a leaked diplomatic cable from halfway across the world has just painted a massive target on his back.
By labeling him Washington's favorite negotiating partner.
Yes. So we have three scenes that seem to belong to, three completely different realities.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at domestic terror in an East Asian dictatorship.
Right.
Maritime extortion in a Middle Eastern choke point. And then high-level political espionage shaking the highest echelons of a theocracy.
But the thing is, they are intimately connected.
They are.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a highly detailed analytical model of a geopolitical crisis set in the year 2026.
And we're really mapping out this massive web, right?
Yeah, shadow diplomacy, military posturing, economic chokehold stretching from Pyongyang to Washington to Tehran.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And our objective is to figure out the mechanics of this crisis. We want to understand how the abstract maneuvers of states trickle all the way down to the individual level.
Exactly. Like, how does a decision made in a closed-door meeting in a foreign capital affect the price of your groceries?
Yes. And perhaps most surprisingly, how does it literally alter your physical brain chemistry?
That is the essential through line here. I mean, the scale of this 2026 scenario is massive. It involves nuclear thresholds and global supply chains.
Stuff that feels way above our pay grade, right?
Right. But the true gravity of analyzing this kind of event is understanding the anatomy of a crisis from the bottom up. We need to dissect how those macro machinations of superpowers translate into the physiological and economic realities of your daily routine.
Before we start really tearing into the nuts and bolts of this, I do need to set a boundary for our listeners.
Important to do.
Yeah, because the framework we are unpacking today deals with highly charged, incredibly tense political maneuvering involving the United States, Iran, North Korea, and the fraught dynamics of global conflict.
It's a minefield.
It really is. We are going to examine military doctrines, public propaganda, and leaked diplomatic strategies. But to do this effectively, we are stripping away the ideology.
Right.
We are not taking sides, and we're not endorsing the political or military viewpoints of any nation involved. Our job is to look at the raw mechanics of statecraft.
We're basically looking at the chessboard.
Exactly. Examining the pieces and explaining the cold, hard rules of the game being played in this 2026 scenario.
Analyzing global conflict requires that level of detachment because, if we get bogged down in moral judgments or ideological biases, we miss the underlying logic driving these actors.
Yeah, you got blinded.
Exactly. We really have to view this through the lens of pure strategy.
So let's start with that underlying logic. And I want to begin with that freezing mother in North Korea.
Because it's such an unexpected starting point.
Right. When you model a Middle Eastern geopolitical crisis involving Iran and the U.S., North Korea feels like an incredibly bizarre place to start looking for fallout. It feels entirely disconnected.
It does. But it highlights the stark disparity between the external projection of an authoritarian state and the internal reality of its citizens.
The public face versus the private fear.
Exactly. Outwardly, the North Korean state projects this monolith of invincibility. The regime's entire public identity is built on military parades, continuous nuclear testing, intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Right, the Juice ideology.
Yes, it demands a narrative of absolute self-reliance and unified defiance against Western imperialism.
But the reality on the ground in regions like Rangrangang or North Hamgyong, far away from the curated, elite-dominated streets of Pyongyang, is pure, unadulterated terror.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the state tightly controls all media, meaning there is zero free press or open internet to verify facts. And when you create an information void, human nature fills it with rumors.
Political scientists actually often refer to this as the reality gap.
The reality gap, I like that term.
Yeah, it's a variation of diversionary war theory. Authoritarian regimes frequently utilize external conflicts, or even just the threat of them, to justify internal hardships.
So in this 2026 model, how does that play out?
Well, the North Korean state uses the escalating tension in the Middle East to justify its own aggressive nuclear buildup.
Oh, so they spin it.
Completely. The state narrative essentially says, look at the instability in the Persian Gulf. Look at the aggression of the imperialists. This is the exact reason our people must sacrifice everything to fund our offensive capabilities and nuclear deterrence.
I have to wonder, though, does the regime actually think the public buys that narrative?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because to me, it's like a failing corporation's CEO announcing an aggressive, multi-billion-dollar hostile takeover of a rival, while the frontline workers are just staring at their broken equipment, wondering if they're even going to get a paycheck.
Right, wondering if the pension fund has been raided.
Exactly. The disconnect is absolute.
Yeah.
Does this kind of propaganda ever actually work when people are just worried about the price of rice?
Well, the regime doesn't necessarily need the public to intellectually believe the narrative. They just need to monopolize the narrative space.
You just need to be the only voice in the room.
Right. However, they miscalculate the psychological toll on the populace. The average citizen who is engaged in a daily, desperate struggle for basic caloric intake and warmth does not conceptualize the world in terms of geopolitical leverage or deterrence.
Which brings us back to that leaked quote from the local markets. Quote, "The Russia war isn't over yet. Will they send troops to Iran too?"
Yeah.
Because it's not about nuclear deterrence for them. It's about a mother calculating the odds of her son being loaded onto a transport plane and sent to a desert thousands of miles away.
And that kind of speculation shatters the illusion of the state's domestic control.
It really does.
Propaganda is highly effective at creating a unified facade, sure, but it completely fails to overwrite the fundamental human drive for security.
You can't PR your way out of survival instinct.
Exactly. According to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you cannot force a population to care about abstract international posturing when their foundational safety needs are under constant threat.
So the state speaks the language of power, but the citizens only process the language of immediate threat.
It's the ultimate loss of autonomy.
Yeah, the fear that your child is just a pawn to be traded for foreign currency or oil. But while North Korean citizens are, spiraling over a hypothetical draft, the actual major players in this conflict are engaged in something entirely different.
Right, they're locked in this intense high-wire act of shadow diplomacy.
Which forces us to shift our focus from the local markets of East Asia to the covert channels connecting Washington and Tehran.
Right. Let's look at the actual negotiations.
Yeah, the scenario introduces this highly detailed, secret 15-point plan for a ceasefire and regional stabilization.
And the logistics of this are fascinating.
Because the U.S. and Iran haven't had formal diplomatic relations since the 1979 hostage crisis.
Right. They can't just send an ambassador across town.
They operate in a complete diplomatic blackout. So Washington drafts this 15-point proposal, but to get it to the Supreme Leader's desk, they have to use an intermediary.
And they choose Pakistan.
Which is wild. I want to dig into that. Because Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, is notoriously labyrinthine.
Oh, absolutely.
They have their hands in every geopolitical pot in the region. Using them as a courier isn't like handing a letter to Switzerland. It carries immense risk.
It does carry risk, but the utilization of Pakistan as a back channel is a masterclass in the mechanics of the protecting power concept in international relations.
Okay, unpack that protecting power concept for me.
So Pakistan occupies a phenomenally complex strategic nexus. On one side of the ledger, they have decades of deep military and intelligence ties with the United States.
Right.
On the other side, they share a porous, highly volatile border with Iran, and they officially manage the Iranian interests section within the Pakistani embassy in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so they're perfectly positioned.
Exactly. A back channel requires an intermediary who understands the red lines of both parties. Pakistan possesses the institutional knowledge to hand-deliver this 15-point plan, not just to a low-level bureaucrat, but directly into the hands of the Iranian decision-makers who actually control the military and nuclear apparatus.
So let's break down what Washington is actually offering in this 15-point framework. Because on paper, this sounds like a standard quid pro quo.
Right, a trade-off.
The core trade-off centers on economic leverage versus military capability. The U.S. offers to roll back crippling economic sanctions, which is, standard.
Expected, yeah.
But the massive concession, the real shocker here, is that the U.S. offers to allow and potentially facilitate civilian nuclear cooperation.
That is a staggering pivot.
It really is.
For decades, the cornerstone of U.S.-Iran policy has been the absolute denial of Iranian nuclear capabilities. Offering civilian cooperation fundamentally alters the negotiating paradigm.
See, I have to push back here, though. Why on earth would the U.S. offer to help build out the nuclear infrastructure of a state they actively consider a primary adversary?
It seems crazy, right?
It sounds counterintuitive to the point of being reckless.
It sounds reckless until you examine the mechanics of uranium enrichment.
Yeah.
The difference between a civilian energy program and a weapons program basically comes down to enrichment thresholds and verification.
Okay.
A light water nuclear reactor used for civilian power is incredibly difficult to weaponize. By offering to legitimize and support a strictly civilian program, the U.S. gains the leverage to demand incredibly intrusive, round-the-clock inspections by the IAEA.
So it's about trading theoretical capacity for verifiable limitation.
Exactly.
They give Iran the prestige of a civilian program in exchange for Iran permanently shutting down deeply buried, highly fortified military enrichment sites like Fordow.
Precisely. And in return for this economic and technological relief,
Yeah.
Iran must agree to two non-negotiable terms.
What are they?
Strictly limiting their ballistic missile program and guaranteeing the absolute safety and unhindered passage of commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Objectively, looking at the board, this is a highly pragmatic deal. So why is the public reaction from Tehran so hostile?
Whoa.
Because the Iranian military spokesmen go on state television and completely mock the proposal. They accuse the U.S. of, quote, negotiating with itself due to internal division.
Right.
And they warn Washington not to try and dress up an American defeat by calling it a bilateral agreement.
We really had to separate performative statecraft from actual policy here.
The public versus private dichotomy.
Exactly. If a regime bases its entire domestic legitimacy on being the vanguard of resistance against Western hegemony, it cannot publicly accept an olive branch.
Right, it looks weak.
To the domestic audience and regional proxy forces, compromise looks like capitulation. The military apparatus must project utter disdain to maintain its ideological purity.
But behind closed doors, the back channel is burning up.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is where the scenario introduces a quote from Donald Trump asserting that despite the public bravado, the U.S. is engaged in deep talks with a very high-ranking figure in Iran.
And that figure is identified as Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf.
Right, the Speaker of the Parliament. And Ghalibaf is an incredibly revealing choice for a negotiating partner.
We really have to look at his institutional pedigree to understand why Washington would target him.
I mean, his resume reads like a masterclass in authoritarian power consolidation.
It really does.
He was the commander of the Revolutionary Guard's Aerospace Force. He served as the chief of police where he violently cracked down on student protests. He was the mayor of Tehran for over a decade, controlling massive municipal budgets.
He is deeply embedded in the state's most vital, hardline power structures.
Yeah.
And this exposes a brutal truth about international diplomacy. Observers often assume the U.S. would prefer to negotiate with reformers or moderates, politicians who use conciliatory language.
Right, the friendly faces.
But in practice, moderates often lack the institutional muscle to enforce a controversial treaty.
Because the moment a moderate signs a deal with the West, the hardliners at home tear it up, call them a traitor, and paralyze the government.
Exactly. It's the Nixon goes to China principle.
Oh, right.
Only a politician with impeccable revolutionary credentials, someone inherently trusted by the military and the supreme leadership, can negotiate with the enemy without being immediately purged.
So Washington looks at Galibov and sees a practical test channel. They are asking, is this the guy strong enough to actually deliver on a compromise?
Yes, but the moment his name is leaked as Washington's preferred partner, it triggers chaos.
Naturally.
Galibov vehemently denies it, and the Iranian media goes into overdrive. They label the leak a deliberate act of American psychological warfare designed to sow paranoia and fracture Tehran's leadership.
Which honestly is a brilliant tactical move by the U.S., intentionally or not.
It perfectly illustrates the fragility of shadow diplomacy. Every secret communication carries the inherent risk of being weaponized if it's exposed.
So we have a deadlocked 15-point plan, diplomats playing 40 chess through Pakistani intelligence, and Iranian politicians fighting off domestic media firestorms.
Quite the mess.
Yeah. But while the politicians argue over paper, Iran makes a calculated move to force the issue in the physical world.
Right.
They target the global economy's most vulnerable choke point.
This is where the abstract world of diplomatic cables crashes violently into the physical reality of global logistics.
The Strait of Hormuz.
They activate the strait.
And the Strait of Hormuz is essentially the jugular vein of the global energy market. A staggering percentage of the world's total daily oil and liquefied natural gas consumption passes through a transit corridor that is incredibly narrow and shallow.
Right. And to understand the military dynamics here, we have to differentiate between a conventional blue water engagement and literal warfare.
Okay, what's the difference?
In a blue water scenario, so open ocean combat, the U.S. Navy's carrier strike groups are virtually uncontested. They have absolute supremacy.
They don't.
Right. But the Strait of Hormuz is littoral. It's shallow, constrained coastal waters.
So it levels the playing field.
Completely.
Iran doesn't need billion-dollar destroyers. They use swarms of cheap, fast-attack speedboats equipped with rocket launchers, naval mines, and shore-based anti-ship missile batteries hidden in the mountainous coastline.
Exactly. It is asymmetrical warfare at its absolute most potent.
Yeah.
By simply credibly threatening commercial shipping in this narrow choke point, Iran exerts massive leverage over the global economy without ever engaging an American warship directly.
The scenario details a specific demand published in the Javan newspaper, and that's a publication closely tied to the Revolutionary Guard, right?
Yes, very closely tied.
So they lay out this staggering transit tax. Every single commercial ship passing through the strait must pay a $2 million insurance fee.
$1 million.
Furthermore, they demand regional countries pay an aggregate sum equal to $50 per barrel of oil as compensation for past damages.
It's unbelievable.
And, just to twist the knife, all U.S. and Israeli vessels are unconditionally banned.
This goes far beyond just, rhetorical posturing. It is a brilliant, highly aggressive weaponization of maritime finance. Iran isn't necessarily planning to sink every ship.
What are they targeting, then?
They're targeting the Joint War Committee in London.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's dive into the actuaries, because this is the invisible gear that runs the world.
The map behind the curtain.
Exactly. Most people think about the physical danger to the ship, but the real impact is on the insurance premiums.
The global shipping industry relies entirely on complex insurance markets, which are primarily based in London. When a waterway like Hormuz is deemed a high-risk conflict zone, the actuaries recalculate what's called the war risk premium.
And those premiums are calculated as a percentage of the ship's total hull and machinery value. So if you have a massive supertanker valued at $150 million, and the war risk premium spikes from a fraction of a percent to, say, 2% overnight, the shipping company suddenly has to pay an extra $3 million just for a 24-hour transit through the strait.
Plus, the $2 million extortion fee demanded by Iran.
Right. The operational cost of a single voyage skyrockets instantly.
And this isn't just a butterfly flapping its wings. This is a surge pricing algorithm applied to the foundational layer of the global energy and food supply.
Because the shipping conglomerate doesn't just absorb a $5 million loss.
Forever.
They immediately pass that cost onto the charterer, the company buying the oil.
Right.
The charterer passes it to the refinery passes it to the wholesale distributor.
And the distributor passes it to the local retail chains.
And finally, it lands on the consumer. You walk into your local grocery store, and the price of staple goods has spiked. You pull up to the gas station, and fuel is unaffordable. You haven't changed a single thing about your life, but your personal finances are taking a direct hit because of a risk assessment made by an actuary in London reacting to a fast attack craft deployed by a hardliner in Tehran.
It is an engineered supply shock. Iran's strategy is to transfer the economic pain of U.S. sanctions directly onto the global public.
Okay, wait. Why target the public?
Because if American and European voters are suddenly furious about skyrocketing inflation and unpayable heating bills, they will exert massive domestic political pressure on their own governments to resolve the crisis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Iran uses global inflation to force Washington back to that 15-point plan.
It's an incredibly effective, incredibly cynical strategy.
It is.
But the financial hit is only the first wave. This is where the 2026 scenario shifts from macro geopolitics to microbiology.
The health impact.
Right. The constant barrage of news about nuclear negotiations, $2 million shipping tolls, and impending global inflation doesn't just empty your wallet. It launches a sustained, devastating assault on your nervous system.
We're transitioning from the logistics of global trade to the architecture of the human brain. The scenario explicitly addresses the physiological consequences of chronic stress induced by unregulated media consumption.
We all know the physical sensation. You wake up, reach for your phone, and the lock screen is a wall of red breaking news banners.
The worst feeling.
Missile strike imminent. Markets plunge. Draft rumors verified. You scroll, and you feel a distinct tightness in your chest. Your breathing gets shallow.
To understand that physical reaction, we have to look deep within the temporal lobes at an almond-shaped cluster of nuclei called the amygdala.
Okay, the amygdala.
The amygdala is part of the limbic system, which is an incredibly ancient, fast-acting part of your brain. Its primary function is threat detection.
It's essentially the body's smoke detector.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. It is a smoke detector perfectly calibrated for a hunter-gatherer environment.
Right.
If an apex predator steps out of the brush, the amygdala processes that visual data and initiates a survival response milliseconds before your conscious, rational brain even recognizes what the animal is.
But I'm just sitting on my couch reading an article about the Strait of Hormuz. I know I'm not in physical danger, so what does this all mean for us on a daily basis? I mean, I can't just ignore the news entirely, but I also don't want my brain thinking a lion is chasing me while I'm sitting on my couch. Why can't my highly evolved prefrontal cortex just override the amygdala and tell it to calm down?
Because of the speed of the neural pathways.
Yeah.
The pathway from your eyes to the amygdala is shorter and faster than the pathway to the prefrontal cortex.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the alarm bells ring before logic can intervene. And when the amygdala sounds the alarm, it triggers the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
The physiological cascade. Let's break that down. What happens?
Well, the hypothalamus sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which in turn signals the adrenal gland sitting on top of your kidneys. They immediately flood your bloodstream with stress hormones, primarily adrenaline and cortisol.
And what does the adrenaline do?
Adrenaline drastically increases your heart rate and blood pressure. It routes oxygen to your major muscle groups so you can fight or flee.
And cortisol.
Cortisol is the heavy hitter. It immediately mobilizes glucose into your bloodstream for explosive energy, but more importantly, it suppresses non-essential bodily functions.
Wait, like what?
It shuts down your digestive system, your reproductive system, and profoundly alters your immune system responses. It dedicates 100% of your body's resources to surviving the next 5 minutes.
Which is brilliant if you actually are running for your life.
Absolutely.
The problem is our modern environment. The smoke detector is perfectly designed, but doom scrolling is the equivalent of placing that smoke detector in a room where you are constantly lighting matches.
Exactly. It creates a profound evolutionary mismatch. A physical threat is acute, it resolves quickly, you escape, and the cortisol clears from your blood.
Right.
But the digital threat is chronic. When you are exposed to a relentless 24/7 news cycle, Your amygdala is constantly firing. You keep your body in a perpetual state of hypervigilance. The cortisol is never allowed to fully metabolize.
This scenario cites a specific, highly relevant study published in the Health Psychology Journal that quantifies this exact phenomenon.
Yes.
They studied individuals consuming news during prolonged global crises, periods exactly like this 2026 model, where the tension drags on for months.
And the researchers established a very clear, highly actionable threshold. They found that consuming threat-based news for more than 30 minutes a day results in a significant sustained elevation in baseline cortisol levels.
Just 30 minutes?
Yeah, 30 minutes.
That is practically nothing. Most people spend 30 minutes scrolling while they drink their morning coffee, let alone the hours of cable news they might watch in the evening.
And that concentrated exposure fundamentally alters your hormonal baseline. The scenario outlines 3 cascading biological consequences that stem from this state of chronic stress.
Let's go through the damage.
Okay.
The first major consequence is a severely weakened immune system.
As we discussed, cortisol suppresses non-essential functions to conserve energy for immediate survival. And the immune system is incredibly energy intensive.
Right.
When cortisol levels remain elevated day after day, it actively suppresses the production of lymphocytes. Those are the white blood cells crucial for fighting off viruses and bacteria.
Wow.
Your body essentially pauses its immune defense, assuming it needs that energy to fight a physical predator that doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
You literally make yourself vulnerable to physical illness by worrying about geopolitical news.
You catch a cold because you're reading about a missile strike. It's wild.
It is.
The second consequence is severe insomnia.
This is a function of the endocrine system. Cortisol and melatonin, which is the hormone that regulates your sleep-wake cycle, operate in an inverse relationship.
Meaning when one is up, the other is down.
Exactly. When cortisol levels are high, melatonin production is suppressed. Again, this makes evolutionary sense. You should not be falling asleep if you are in active danger.
But if you are doom scrolling in bed, reading about war risk premiums and naval blockades, your amygdala perceives a threat, spikes your cortisol, completely crushes your melatonin production, and leaves you lying in the dark with a racing heart.
Precisely. And the third consequence is a dramatic increase in emotional eating and cravings for highly processed, sugary foods.
I think everyone can relate to this. You feel stressed and suddenly you desperately need a donut.
Yep.
What is the biological mechanism there?
When your body is flooded with cortisol, it operates under the assumption that you have just exerted a massive amount of physical energy running from a threat. It demands that you replenish those caloric stores immediately.
And sugar is the fastest way to do that.
The fastest, most biologically available form of energy is simple carbohydrates and sugar.
Furthermore, consuming high-sugar, high-fat foods triggers a massive release of dopamine in the brain.
Yes, the dopamine provides a temporary chemical soothing effect. It is a powerful counter-regulatory mechanism against the anxiety caused by cortisol.
So you read a terrifying article about North Korean troop movements. Your amygdala fires, cortisol spikes, your immune system tanks, you can't sleep, and your brain screams at you to eat a pint of ice cream just to artificially induce a fleeting moment of comfort.
It is a vicious, self-destructive loop.
It's a perfect storm of physiological dysregulation, triggered entirely by an unregulated stream of information about macro events over which you have absolutely zero direct control.
Which is why we aren't just going to leave you with the bleak reality of your failing endocrine system.
Thank goodness for that.
The final phase of this 2026 scenario outlines a tactical, highly specific survival prescription for the mind. It provides 4 actionable interventions to stay informed about the state of the world without allowing the world to destroy your internal equilibrium.
And these aren't just, lifestyle suggestions. They are necessary neurological interventions designed to break the cycle of chronic stress and restore cognitive function.
Exactly.
So intervention number 1, the 20-minute rule. The protocol dictates a strict, non-negotiable limit on daily news consumption. 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the evening.
This directly addresses the health psychology study's findings. By capping your consumption at 20 minutes, you stay safely below the 30-minute threshold that triggers sustained cortisol elevation.
Makes sense.
It requires treating news consumption exactly like a potent pharmacological intervention. You need the correct dosage to cure the disease of ignorance, but an overdose is highly toxic.
And the protocol specifically dictates when you must avoid the news. You cannot consume that evening 10 minutes right before bed.
No, definitely not.
This isn't just about the psychological stress of the headlines. It's about the hardware you are using.
The physical device itself is a problem. The blue light emitted by smartphone and tablet screens perfectly mimics the frequency of daylight.
Oh,
When this light hits the photoreceptors in your retina, it sends a signal directly to the pineal gland in the brain to halt the secretion of melatonin.
so doom scrolling in bed hits you with a double blow. You get the psychological cortisol spike from the terrifying geopolitical news and the physiological melatonin suppression from the blue light.
Right. You are actively commanding your nervous system to stay awake and panic.
10 minutes over breakfast, 10 minutes after dinner, then the device is put away.
Good rule to live by.
Intervention number 2.
Yeah.
Notification fasting.
This one is huge.
The protocol challenges the individual to go into their device settings and permanently disable all breaking news push notifications.
This is a critical step in breaking an intermittent variable reward loop. Silicon Valley engineers designed push notifications using the exact same psychological principles that make slot machines so addictive.
Right, B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning.
Exactly.
They hijack your attention by presenting novel, highly stimulating information at completely unpredictable intervals.
And that unpredictability creates a dopamine deficit that keeps your brain constantly anticipating the next alert. It keeps the amygdala in a state of low-level, permanent hypervigilance.
I always look at it this way. If a catastrophic, world-altering event actually occurs, if a major conflict truly breaks out, you will find out.
Oh, absolutely.
The sirens will go off, the markets will halt, your neighbor will run over. The world will ensure you know. You do not need a red banner popping up on your screen every 12 minutes while you are trying to focus on a spreadsheet or eat dinner with your family, just to tell you that a foreign minister issued a sternly worded statement.
No, you don't.
It is synthetic urgency. If a missile strikes, you'll find out. You don't need a red alert popping up every 5 minutes to ruin your day.
By disabling notifications, you transition from being a passive victim of the news cycle to an active consumer. You reclaim your agency. You decide when to engage with the world, rather than allowing the world to violently interrupt your focus.
Which leads perfectly into intervention number 3, the circle of control.
A very Stoic concept.
Yeah, this is about localizing your agency.
It is the practical application of Stoic philosophy,
Yeah.
specifically the teachings of Epictetus.
Yeah.
He argued that the foundation of a resilient mind is the ability to ruthlessly categorize the world into 2 columns, things you can control and things you cannot.
So you cannot control the supreme leadership in Pyongyang.
Right.
You cannot negotiate war risk premiums with maritime actuaries in London. You cannot oversee the back-channel communications between the ISI and Washington.
Expending cognitive and emotional energy on those macro events is entirely futile. It generates profound anxiety without offering any mechanism for resolution. You are fighting a ghost.
But the protocol shifts focus to what is within your circle of control. You can control your sleep hygiene by enforcing the 20-minute rule.
Yes.
You can control your personal monthly budget, adjusting your spending to absorb the reality of inflation caused by the Strait of Hormuz choke point. You can control the depth of your presence when spending time with your family. Focus energy where it has an impact.
By localizing your focus, you build psychological resilience. You construct a stable, highly functional internal foundation that allows you to weather the macroeconomic shocks without collapsing into despair.
And finally, intervention number 4, physical stress release.
For when the news does get through.
Exactly. Sometimes the news inevitably breaches your defenses. You read something truly alarming, and you feel that immediate, unmistakable spike of adrenaline and cortisol. The protocol provides a physiological hack to manually override the amygdala.
Right.
It prescribes a specific breathing pattern. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold the breath for 7 seconds, and exhale for a long, slow 8 seconds.
This is a brilliant use of the body's hardware to fix a software glitch.
But how does breathing actually change my brain chemistry in the middle of a panic response?
It centers on the vagus nerve, which is the primary superhighway of the parasympathetic nervous system.
The parasympathetic system is the rest and digest network, the exact opposite of the fight or flight sympathetic system driven by the amygdala, right?
Exactly. When you deliberately alter your respiration specifically by making the exhale significantly longer than the inhale, you physically stimulate the vagus nerve.
Okay, and what happens then?
The vagus nerve then releases a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine directly onto the pacemaker cells of your heart.
Slowing the heart rate down chemically.
Yes. It sends a massive, undeniable neurological signal back to the brain stating, "I am safe." The brain's logic is simple. You cannot possibly be running from a predator if you are capable of breathing out slowly for 8 seconds.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
The brain receives this physiological feedback and forcefully halts the HPA axis. It stops the secretion of cortisol. It is a manual off switch for panic.
Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. It sounds almost too simple, but you are literally utilizing neurotransmitters to force your nervous system to stand down.
You cannot stop the geopolitical crisis from unfolding, but you possess the biological tools to stop a crisis from destroying your internal equilibrium.
This has been an immense, intricate journey. We started this deep dive in the freezing, rumor-filled markets of North Korea, examining how authoritarian regimes utilize the threat of foreign wars to manage domestic terror.
We really covered a lot of ground.
We did. We name-gated the shadowy, high-stakes diplomacy between Washington and Tehran, utilizing Pakistani intelligence as a back channel for a massive nuclear concession.
Right.
We watched the global economy get held hostage in the Strait of Hormuz, tracing how maritime actuaries calculating war risk premiums translate directly into skyrocketing prices at your local grocery store.
Yeah.
And finally, we ended up deep inside the temporal lobes of your own brain, exploring how this relentless barrage of information hijacks your amygdala, floods your endocrine system with cortisol, and demands a rigorous tactical prescription to maintain your physiological health.
It provides a comprehensive, unified theory of a modern crisis, really demonstrating how macro-level statecraft cascades relentlessly down to the micro-level of individual biology.
It's all connected.
It is. And while the scale of this 2026 framework is undeniably intimidating, historical perspective is vital here.
Yeah, that's important to remember.
The global system has survived grand, sweeping crises before. We have navigated world wars, nuclear standoffs, and severe economic depressions. Geopolitical plates will always shift, and states will continually negotiate under fire.
The machine of history never actually stops turning.
No, it does not. The true task for the individual is not to solve the geopolitical puzzle that is vastly beyond our locus of control.
Right.
The task is to maintain intellectual clarity and situational awareness without surrendering to panic or the contagion of digital rumors. We must understand the mechanics of the world so that we can navigate it strategically, preserving our cognitive function and our health so that we can continue to build our lives, regardless of the headlines.
That is the ultimate takeaway here, and I'd ask you, the listener, to consider the practical application of this.
It's so important to share this stuff.
It really is. If you found these tactical neurological interventions helpful, share them. We all know someone who is entirely consumed by the news cycle, who is doom scrolling at 2 in the morning and operating in a state of chronic anxiety.
We definitely all know someone like that.
Walk them through the 20-minute rule. Explain the mechanism of the 4-7-8 breathing technique. Sometimes the most profound action we can take during a massive global crisis is simply helping the people around us stay biologically grounded.
A regulated nervous system is the foundation of a resilient mind.
As we close out this deep dive into the mechanics of the 2026 crisis, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought.
Okay.
We've spent the last hour analyzing nations fighting desperately for control. We've looked at the fight for narrative control in East Asia, the fight for physical control over vital shipping lanes in the Middle East, and the use of economic blockades to force diplomatic submission.
Right.
But after unpacking the sheer biological devastation caused by chronic media stress, we are forced to ask a much deeper question about the nature of modern conflict.
We really have to ask what the actual battleground is.
If consuming just 30 minutes of unregulated news a day can literally suppress your immune system, dismantle your sleep architecture, and fundamentally alter your brain chemistry, is it possible that the ultimate geopolitical weapon of the 21st century isn't a ballistic missile or a maritime blockade?
Wow.
Is it possible the ultimate geopolitical weapon is our own unregulated attention?
That's a profound thought.
Remember the freezing North Korean mother terrified by whispers, the cargo captain staring at his radar waiting for an extortion demand, and the politician caught in a media firestorm? They are all, in their own way, victims of the narratives they are forced to navigate.
Yeah.
As nations fight for control over straits and borders, take control of your attention, protect your internal peace. Until next time.